When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters because of me this night." Then he went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to grieve and be agitated. When they had sung that last hymn, how etched last memories become on our minds. I wonder how many of us can remember the last hymn we sang together as church, the last service we went to before the lockdown began. Who was there? What was the weather like that day? We often remember the tiniest details of days or hours before a moment of extreme stress, more than the moment itself perhaps, and what it signified. We remember where we were and what we were doing when the news of a family tragedy came through. I can still remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when the trade towers in New York were attacked on September 11th, 2001. The grief Jesus experiences in the Garden of Gethsemane is, I think, defined as much by what he may have been remembering as it is by the anticipation of the terrible things that are about to happen to him. Perhaps he had flashbacks to moments in his life when he would have experienced a shadow, a foretelling of this moment. He may suddenly recall someone's remark or gesture or way of behaving which, for some reason, is resurfacing in this moment of testing, this ultimate decision that he must take when a choice has to be made. Must I go through with this or not? This is the last decision that he will ever make, and he begs not to have to make it. How often have we found ourselves having to make decisions that we wish we did not have to make? The decision to end a relationship, perhaps, or someone else's job, or even a life. We like to think we did what was for the best, but that may not have always been the case. Perhaps there were times when we faltered and went for the soft option in a controversy or dispute. Anything for a quiet life. Then there are those times when it's so much easier to remain quiet rather than speak out for justice, no matter what the personal cost. There are so many times in our lives when we wish and pray that this particular test could pass us by. Sometimes it does, but often only as a result of compromise that leaves us feeling ashamed. Sometimes it doesn't, and we brave it out, feeling alone and exposed. Our choices also make us responsible for other people's loss, for their disappointments, for their grief. Under the full weight of what he was choosing that night in the garden, Jesus experiences grief. It's a grief which meets us in our own darkest moments of depression or loss. He meets us in our disappointments, from the greatest of them to the least. Disappointment and the sense of failure that often comes with it can often feel like a kind of betrayal. We feel, rightly or wrongly, that someone else is to blame for our disappointment. We feel betrayed. And what of Peter's hollow promises in all this? That he and the others would willingly die rather than let Jesus be betrayed and killed. I think his protests are a reflection of our own fantasies. The pictures we cherish of ourselves being heroic in a situation of danger or extreme stress, or benevolently powerful, the pillars of an organisation, persons of stamina and grit who would never fold under testing. Peter's protestations of loyalty are all the selves we would love to be, but are not. Jesus sees our fantasies for what they are. He responds to Peter's own delusions of grandeur by telling him to get behind me, Satan, as Peter insists that he would never allow death or suffering to touch the master he loves. This shall never happen to you, he says. It would be so easy for Jesus to believe him. Other people's delusions can be as seductive as our own. It would have been easy, perhaps, for Jesus to tell himself that his friends would be there for him. But this would have placed a burden of guilt on them when they failed to live up to their own expectations, as they were bound to do. So it was better that he not count on their loyalty. Better to know the reality and face into it. It was his choice, after all. But whose choice is it? His or his father's? What kind of father would compel his son to make such a choice? Is he still God's son in all this, and not some deluded individual? And when it comes to who he is, then is he less than the Father, and so not fully God as well as fully man? In all of these doubts, there remains the struggle and the prayer, the why and the must I. Given all this, we're left wondering how the Father answers him, if he answers him at all, which he appears not to do. Perhaps the Father's answer speaks from the silence, as is often the way with our own prayers when they seem to go unanswered. The silence from the Father is the answer, but the answer is spoken by Jesus himself. If it is your will, let it be so. Words which resonate in a profound way with the words of Mary at the moment of the Incarnation, when God takes flesh and becomes as we are. Let it be so, she says. So now in the Garden of Gethsemane, we're brought full circle to the beginning of the great salvation story, to the beginning of all things, to the creation moment, the let it be so that we hear repeatedly spoken in the book of Genesis. Everything is of a piece. The creation of the universe, the coming of the Christ, and his acquiescence to God's will and to human suffering at the hands of those who envy him. Envy being perhaps the basis of all human sin. So they arrest Jesus in the garden and take him first to the religious authorities, to Annas, father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. And there he's interrogated. As with all prisoners under interrogation, Jesus is disorientated and afraid, perhaps grasping at the hope that he'll somehow be delivered from this ordeal at the last minute. Those questioning him seem ill at ease. They're motivated by envy. As I said at the end of the last meditation, envy is perhaps the root of all human sin, along with the fear that it engenders. Fear of the consequences if we don't speak or act to justify ourselves. The need to win approval. Fear of falling out of favour with a powerful inner circle. Fear of failing to deliver. Those in authority who are judging Jesus are also afraid of failing to deliver, of failing to please those who pay them or from whom they're seeking preferment, perhaps. It's a frightening situation, not only for Jesus himself, but also for those few friends who've stuck with him. Even though they couldn't defend him, or at least when one of them tried to, by cutting off the ear of one of his assailants, Jesus insisted on healing him. Another had tried, and then run away in fear, leaving his clothes behind. Peter is there in the background, feeling ashamed and fearful as well. And there are perhaps others who are not mentioned in the Passion narratives. The women who've loved him, his own siblings perhaps. And what of those sitting in judgment on him? The religious and secular authorities have different agendas. The religious authorities want to placate the secular government and win favours for themselves. It would be expedient, they decide, for one man to die for the people, little realising the wider implications of that statement. Another powerful man, a secular leader, is more concerned with placating the people, whose actions he would be answerable for should their frustration boil over into a riot, which he might not be able to quell. There seems to be a compression of time in all the toing and froing between Annas and the high priest Caiaphas, and between Pilate and Herod, the governor of Judea. In between these hearings and the return of Jesus to Pilate after he's been tortured, legend has it that he was lowered into a pit. Later he will be surrounded by accusers, questioned and probed. He will not be believed. He will be judged and then condemned. The trial resonates with times in our own lives when we may have been under scrutiny, questioned about something that happened that we might have been involved with, or accused of something we didn't do, or questioned about things that may have happened to us, bad things that people would prefer not to believe. Not being believed puts us in a defense mode. It makes us critical of ourselves and of others. Those who grow up with criticism spend the rest of their lives in defense mode. They must always be justifying themselves. We all play endless games of blame shifting in order to get through life. Jesus does none of these things. He doesn't seek to justify himself. Indeed, he has no need to, since all his accusers have seen and heard him speak in public. He has nothing to hide and nothing to justify, which they know, of course, and this makes them afraid. There is grace and strength for all of us in his integrity of spirit and in his steadfastness. The truth can be a frightening thing for the accuser. So the accuser will try to deflect it, to twist it into something that suits their purposes. Rarely does a person put under extreme pressure in an interrogation have enough presence of mind to be able to respond calmly and intelligently to such accusations, especially if they've been tortured. Torture is designed to break a person's spirit. As a result, the will to respond is also broken. They just don't care anymore. In the interrogation that Jesus is submitting to, there's an intertwining of envy and fear. The religious authorities envy Jesus. He seems to have come from almost nowhere, and yet he has such grip in every sense of the word. He has a profound understanding of Scripture. He can unlock its secrets and convey them to ordinary people in ways that the priests were never able to do. He can run rings round them intellectually, and has done so on numerous occasions, revealing their hypocrisy, greed, and crude ambition. They envy him his gifts, but most of all, they envy the way the people love him. The people love him because he's offering them a way out from dead religion. He's offering them life. And he's offering it not only to the people, but to the religious leaders as well. He's offering them release from a law which, like all laws and systems that have outlived their purpose, is a burden to everyone, people and rulers alike. The religious authorities know this, but they profit materially from the status quo. So it is expedient that Jesus should be got rid of. The authorities fear Jesus because he has power. He's powerful because he connects people with the truth they need to hear, the truth that is life. The secular authorities have no way of dealing with someone who has this kind of power, but is without ambition. So they despise him as much as they envy him. They don't know what to do with him. They find it hard to define just what it is they envy him for. Furthermore, if a person doesn't want power, it's very hard to make false accusations stick to them. The accusations seem to peel off of their own accord, so that the accusers become desperate and have to invent new lies to bring them down with, as they did with Jesus, who they accused of blasphemy, and as they have done to good people caught up in the power play of politics down through the centuries. Status is what his secular accusers understand best, so they question him along those lines. Is he the King of the Jews? And his answer that his kingdom is of an altogether different order leaves them feeling nonplussed, left-footed, and irritated. But he cuts through all their vanity and hubris, revealing it for what it is, by saying that those who really want to know truth will listen to his voice. What he's saying to us, then, is not that his words are the only true words that have ever been spoken, but that there is a life-giving truth lodged in all of us that waits to be revealed, to be known, and that when a person comes to terms with this reality, with this truth, and their need to hear it spoken, they will hear it in his voice. The way of the cross is none other than the way of life. But how is that so? How can we reconcile the agonized stumbling of a tortured man bearing the weight of his own gallows up a hill under the mocking eyes of a crowd as the way of life? What does this tell us about how Christians or anyone else should think about suffering? Are we, as Christians, to seek out suffering and offer it to God as some kind of oblation? I don't think so. And yet, as we contemplate this suffering diminished figure, something tells us that there is life and hope in his agonized stumbling, that he supports us in our own stumbling and in the falls we experience in life, that he holds us in the strength of his weakness. Reflect for a moment on Christ's surroundings and on the immediate context. He's just come from being tortured and condemned to death. It's the busiest time of day, and the streets are crowded. The women who stood by him are close at hand, as is his mother. What emotions is she experiencing as she watches her son struggle in agony up this hill? She experiences what all mothers experience when they see their children in pain, especially if it is undeserved and they can do nothing to alleviate it. Perhaps she shares in his shame as well as in the pain, but she walks alongside him, willing him on every step of the way, and yet wishing that he didn't have to take a single one of those steps. And what of the curious bystanders? How do they come to be there? What's really going on in their minds? I remember a scene I witnessed once in New York. Someone had just jumped from the top floor window of a high building. The body was surrounded by a tight little group of passers-by. They were just looking, drawn to this tragic death, but not knowing what to do or say or think about it. Just like many of the people who are following Jesus through the streets of Jerusalem to Golgotha. They're curious, fascinated perhaps. Others are angry. Perhaps he's rebuked them at some point. So they feel that this arrogant upstart has got his just deserts. Others are saying to themselves that he was a sham, a charlatan. But as is so often the case when we project our anger onto another person, they're perhaps angry about other things, their lives, their personal disappointments and frustrations, a sudden sickness that's come among them, their inability to control others. And now they have a scapegoat on which to heap their pain and anger. They're envious, but they're satisfied. How have the mighty fallen, they're thinking. And what of Jesus himself? He swims in and out of consciousness, noticing the little things, tiny spring flowers pushing up through the stones along the way, the half-remembered face of an onlooker. Which is the hardest to bear, the mental or the physical pain? The remembering of friendships and of good things that may have happened only a day or two ago? Or the unbearable weight of his own gallows pressing in on his shoulder? Every breath is physical torture. And as he takes another step, another breath, he's suddenly alongside the poet Michael Rosen, who's fighting COVID in A&E, gasping for breath. The year's seasons roll by in a night, he says. Sweats, freezes, sweats, freezes. It feels like I can't get enough air. There isn't enough air. I can't catch up. There are moments I feel hotter than I've ever felt before, and moments when I'm colder than ever before. I shudder as if I am naked out of doors. So this COVID sufferer, along with millions of others, is taken into Christ's agonizing walk. Christ is walking the walk of all of our lives, especially the hard parts. And then he falls again. The soldiers try to haul him to his feet. Time is pressing. They're in a hurry. They don't want this to take forever. There's still an execution to get through. And they have to hang around until the victims are dead. It's all taking far too long. And then they spot a substitute, an able-bodied man who happens to be in town that day and got caught up in the crowd as he was on his way to a job or to a meeting perhaps. So they grab this man, Simon, who's come up from Cyrene, and force him to carry the cross. What does he feel in that moment? Is he annoyed by the inconvenience or embarrassed? Or does he find himself sharing in something far greater than he will ever be able to describe? Suddenly able to see the suffering of the whole world in this split moment of encountering the gaze of the one whose cross he's about to carry. Does he realize the significance of the moment? That the victim, who seems to have something about him that is quite beyond the ordinary, something that shines through him, that this victim is willingly sharing in all of our suffering. And what of the glances that are exchanged? Simon caught the eye of the guard who selected him. As he goes to take up the cross, his eyes travel to the face of the victim. He's met with gratitude, relief, exhaustion. Jesus looks at Simon, and in the very instant of that looking, Simon sees the whole of his life laid out before him. All of it is known to Jesus. Not one detail of it is insignificant. But as usually happens in such rare moments of profound understanding, Simon is returned quite quickly to his own time and to his own world, to the narrow framework of things that need doing, of what matters to him and what doesn't. Did he miss his meeting or appointment? And if he did it matter? In fact, did anything that he had been doing with his life up to that point really matter in the sense he thought it did? Something of far greater importance is happening to him now, as he takes the load from Christ's shoulders and realizes the significance of what he's carrying. When Jesus takes up his cross, and as he stumbles and falls up that hill, he's giving us his life in exchange for ours. It's worth taking time to understand this. It obliges us to see our lives in a completely different way and to ask ourselves what it is about his life and what it is about our lives that matters. Jesus once told his followers that they should take upon themselves his yoke, his burden, because his burden is light and easy to carry. But the cross isn't light or easy to carry for Simon of Cyrene, even though in the moment of taking it, he experiences something of that lightness, a lightness of being, in return for his own private heaviness of soul. When they finally reach Golgotha, does Simon stay for what follows? Does he join the other bystanders and watch the horrible execution? Or does he head back to his own life as quickly as possible, anxious to forget anxious to make his apologies to the meeting he should have attended, anxious to put it all behind him. Will we do that? Head back to our own lives after coming face to face with the reality of what is happening in this passion narrative and its implications for us personally? Or will we stay a little? Stay with the story, and then with those who need us, those who have a story to tell about their own suffering or need. Can we stay just a little longer to hear the stories others tell of themselves, or find it hard to tell? Will we ask them how their lives are going? Or will we hurry back to our own lives, trying, perhaps, to forget? And so they come to the place of execution. There is a point when a person is experiencing acute pain, when they know that they must somehow hold on. Jesus has got to hold on to the pain. He can't allow himself the merciful release of death. There's still work to be done, so he must stay with it. Sometimes you know that you must stay with it, if not for your own sake, then for someone else's. It's the baby's life that matters to the woman in labour, when she longs for the pain to end. Or for the person dying of cancer, it's the last chance to say sorry to a friend they've wronged. They will themselves to stay with it. And so with Jesus, he wills himself to carry on, not for his own sake or for the sake of any one person, but for the sake of the world. and for the sake of that mysterious thing we call salvation. He bears each and every moment of physical and emotional pain. The moment that he's pushed to the ground and nailed to the cross is also the moment when, centuries later, the soldier falls into the trench hells of the Somme, or who, running into battle, falls into the shattered body of a comrade, his best friend perhaps. It turns his mind. He will never be the same person again. The soldiers who force Jesus down onto the cross are like all bullies. They're essentially weak. In years to come, they'll tell themselves that they were only doing their job. But the words will lose credibility as the years go by. They'll remember pushing the broken body down onto the cross, justifying their actions to themselves. He had it coming to him. One of the criminals being killed alongside Jesus echoes these unspoken thoughts, but in reverse. This man is innocent. We did wrong. It was we who had it coming to us. So, along with the pain he's dealing with, Jesus will also be aware of the thoughts and feelings of those around him in this moment. Does he have the will to think or respond? There is something about extreme pain that cuts through everything that is not relevant to the moment. So we're struck by the acuity of the few words Jesus speaks from the cross. How vital they are, not only for the people directly concerned, but for all of us. Father, forgive. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. All of them words that embody total giving, a generosity that withholds nothing for the giver, a total surrendering of all that is one's own. In all the pain, Jesus consciously retains control, to have enough control, enough will, in order to be able to cede control, to cede every vestige of autonomy as a human being. First, he cedes it to the soldiers, and in a little while, he will cede it to his Father. When the time is right, he will cede all control. We're reminded of those moments in the Gospels when he speaks of his time. My time is not yet come. Is he talking about destiny? Or more importantly, is he talking about meaning and purpose? The meaning and purpose of this horrendous choice he's made to die in this way, which is bound up with the meaning and purpose of all of our lives. It's bound up with all our life choices and with each of our moments of dying. So there he is in A&E with the person battling with COVID or with some other critical condition. He's with them, retaining their will to live in his own will to go on living for as long as it takes. There he is with the person who's just regained consciousness after a serious accident and is being told that they'll spend the rest of their life in a wheelchair. He's alongside them as they come to terms with the fact that they will never be the same again, that they face a new and difficult life. He holds them until they take hold of the will to live it. But for Jesus, still more things have to take place so that all that has been prophesied in Scripture can be fulfilled. Which is not to say that prophecy must come true as if it were some kind of fate, but that the purposes of God for humanity's salvation must take place in the hours that remain to him. They take place through the pain that Jesus is experiencing and through the words that he speaks. At the heart of the words is the idea of forgiveness. He asks the Father to forgive his torturers, for they know not what they do. But they do know what they're doing. They are inflicting unspeakable pain onto an already broken man. But they also don't know. They have no idea of the nature of the sacrilege they are committing. One wonders if any of them would have desisted at the last minute had they known who Jesus was. It's a moment that I find resurfaces every time I hear the word Christ or Jesus used as an expletive or as a swear word. I have to suppose that the person using it has no idea what they're saying. And there are other things that must take place in order to fulfill Scripture. The soldiers must gamble for his clothes. Having one's clothes taken leaves a person feeling diminished, whether it's a matter of the clothes being replaced by a hospital gown prior to an operation, or by a prison uniform as you begin your sentence. You're vulnerable. The soldiers divide up the clothes between them, as if these things were nothing at all, although I suspect that as they do this, the clothes become something. And then they gamble for the seamless robe, in order that the prophecy of Scripture be fulfilled. And how did these men feel as they were joking and gambling? Did the truth of the situation begin to dawn on them? And did they try to keep playing so as to block it out of their minds in order not to know the significance of what they were really doing? They'd be trying to tell themselves that this was just a routine execution. It would be a shame to tear the seamless robe. The women who had lovingly made these garments and woven the robe would have seen what the soldiers were doing. They would have been angry and outraged, and shared perhaps something of the shame that Jesus was experiencing in that moment. Into their feelings intrudes the shouting and jeering of the bystanders. "If you're the Christ, get down from that cross." And from one of the criminals, "If you're the Christ, save us and save yourself." The irony of those words is lost on them, however, because the Saviour of the world is no mere wonder worker. The other criminal has a quite different request to make. He asks Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom. What a powerful word that is, remember. It asks more of us than we perhaps realise, and it often serves as a kind of warning. Remember those who have died, and in so many cases, why they died so needlessly. Remember this planet that is dying. Will Jesus be remembering forward into our own times? His dying is part of the dying of the earth. But to return to the condemned man who is at Jesus' side, his cry is ours too. It is all of us asking to be remembered, not to know oblivion when we ourselves die, but to know life and to be held in Christ's embrace in the moment of our dying. So this man is promised that on that very day, Jesus will welcome him into his kingdom. Not long after that, Jesus finally submits, knowing that all has been accomplished, that his time has come. He submits his spirit into the Father's hands. then what? What of the Sabbath day that follows? What happens during this middle time? There is one more place that he must visit before his work is fully accomplished. He must descend into hell itself. Painters, poets, and artists have sought to depict hell, and many people have experienced it in life, in war, in personal tragedy, in the depths of despair. But what was the hell that Jesus visited? Who or what did he find there? Perhaps he took poor old despairing Judas by the hand, along with the rest of us, when we're tempted to give in to despair. Perhaps he grasped the hands of Adam and Eve, the archetypes of fallen humanity. Did he find in hell a place of fire and torment? Or was it just a sterile, empty darkness? Did he descend into the barren emptiness of secular materialism, which we as consumers are forced to inhabit? Jesus descends into hell in order to be there for us too, in our own hells, when there is nothing left worth living for, despite all the things we may have achieved or acquired in the course of a lifetime. He goes down there to meet us in whatever the place is that we're afraid of descending to in the moment of our own dying, ready to bring us with him up into the light of Easter.